Well, hello again, Spring Lake Village. Well, today marks, believe it or not, the 1 year anniversary since I was with you in person in your theater at Spring Lake. So 1 year has passed. I'm really hoping that in a short time, we'll actually be back together again. I assume many of you have received your second dose of the corona vaccine. I guess I'll have to wait some time. But in any case, I'm sure we'll be back soon enough. Well, today we're also going to mark another anniversary, a watershed in the history of the Greeks, namely the bicentennial of the Greek War of Independence. This March marks the 200th anniversary of the Greek War of Independence, which commenced in March of 1821. And as I noted in the handout you should have received, I'm going to devote 2 months to this new lecture series. I haven't had a lecture series that ran usually more than 4 or 5 weeks. World War I was a 2 month affair, as was our lecture series on the Civil War. But it's been a while since I've devoted so much time, but it's not only a very important chapter in world history, but a very exciting one, a colorful one, full of remarkable heroes, adventurers, etc. It was a successful war in the end, but it wouldn't have happened without the great powers, in particular, France, Britain, Russia, backing the Greeks when they needed them most. And it was the first successful war of liberation against Ottoman rule. So today we're going to discuss in our first lecture uh, the 400 years of Ottoman rule. So one lecture has to be devoted to that period before we actually begin our discussion of the Greek War of Independence. So the Greeks were under the yoke of the Ottoman Turks, the last great dynasty, the last great Islamic rule in the Middle East. They ruled the Greek world for nearly 4 centuries, beginning with the fall of Constantinople on Easter Sunday, the 29th of May, 1453. The great city of Constantinople, now renamed Istanbul. And as I think I've mentioned in earlier lectures, this word Istanbul is in fact a Turkish corruption of the Greek word stinpoli, which means to the city. So in the same way we might say I'm going to the city, we're referring to going to the city of San Francisco. So too at that time would both Ottoman Turks as well as Greeks say Istanbul, meaning I'm going to the city. In any case, Constantinople, that great city founded by Constantine the Great in the 320s, the great imperial capital of the Byzantine Empire for nearly 1,000 years, the strongest, most impregnable city of the ancient world, finally fell to the forces of Mehmet II in 1453. And this marked then the snuffing out of the Byzantine world. Although on the Greek mainland, there was one last holdout, one last stronghold, the famous fortress city of Mistras, which is located in the Peloponnese, not far from the ancient city of Sparta. This also became the epicenter of Greek scholarship. So when many refugees, many of the flower of the Greek aristocracy, the Byzantine aristocracy, fled the Ottoman Turks once they captured Constantinople. Many intellectuals fled to this last stronghold, and we had the last flowering of Byzantine culture. This became a great repository of Byzantine knowledge, preservation of manuscripts, and it would hold out for a number of years before it too was overtaken by the Turks. And so this then begins the nearly 4 centuries, the 400 years of Greece being controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And it is called in Greek, and even today, the Greeks refer to this dark chapter in this here in their history as the rule of the Turks, or Turkokratia, as in demokratia, meaning the rule or the power of the Turks. Now, one of the major epicenters of Ottoman suzerainty was in the Peloponnese, the southern Greek mainland, which for several hundred years had been called the Morea, not the Peloponneso as it had been called for many, many centuries since the time of antiquity, but the Morea. And this region was divided into a number of feudal kingdoms, among which were Venetian kingdoms, because the Venetians also controlled parts of Greece. In particular, southeastern Greece was under the control of the Venetians. But for the most part, the Ottoman Turks, the Muslim Turks, held sway over most of Greece, except some of the very rugged mountainous areas, including south central Morea called the Mani. The Mani, famous for its fearsome warriors, the Maniotes, which even today are feared, these great guerrilla warriors. So Ottoman Greece was a truly multi-ethnic society. And as we've discussed, when we discussed Armenia, those that were controlled, the non-Muslims, including Jews, Greeks, Armenians, other minority populations that were under control of the Ottoman Turks, were divided by nation states under the so-called millet system. And so each of these nations or peoples that lived under the suzerainty of the Sublime Porte in Constantinople were given a certain amount of autonomy in order to oversee their populations. So as we discussed, the Armenians enjoyed certain privileges and certain autonomy, and this was true of the Greeks in historic Greece. The Patriarch of Greece and other leaders oversaw their populations, and so long as they paid taxes, abided by Ottoman jurisprudence, Sharia law, etc., understood that they were second-class citizens under the millet system, Greeks enjoyed a certain amount of freedom. But there were many times in which they were severely punished and oppressed, and there were certain types of pogroms that were unleashed against the Greek population. So a lot of the Ottomans were very corrupt. They were far away from the great imperial capital of Istanbul, and many of them became rapacious. They exacted even more money from the local population. They lived these sort of opulent lifestyles. We have many stories of how they lived, especially during the waning days of the Ottoman Empire. They became more corrupt, etc. Now, the Ottomans, in the same way they had divided up historic Armenia into disparate provinces in different regions, so too was Greece divided up into different regions called sanjaks. And in each of these provinces, an Ottoman official called a bey, B-E-Y, I'm sure you've heard of that word before. It's sort of a general term given to a local chieftain or governor. So in this case, we had the Sanjak Beys who were in control of these various districts or regions that were created by the Ottoman authorities back in Istanbul. And the Beys' primary function was to maintain the peace in that region. And so they had standing armies, which they controlled, and they also collected the taxes from the local Greeks. It was necessary for a lot of the upper class Greeks, in order to protect the people they protected and who were under their control to bribe the corrupt beys and the various pashas. This is a picture here of the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And down here is a color engraving showing an Ottoman bey walking the streets of the Turkish Plaka, the famous historic district at the foot of the Acropolis. Here's a picture of the great circuit walls, those great impenetrable circuit walls rebuilt over many centuries that had protected the great city of Constantinople for nearly a millennium. And still today, if you go to Istanbul, I know many of you are still impressed by these extraordinary walls, and yet they were breached on that fateful day in May of 1453. Here's the last stronghold on mainland Greece, the magnificent hillside fortress city of Mistras, and there are a number of beautiful Greek Orthodox churches, many dating to the last heyday of Byzantine architecture, especially from the late 14th and the 15th century. Church of Aie Triada, the Church of Pantokratora. This is just a magnificent, beautiful site which you can still visit today in the hills of the Peloponnese, again, not far from the city of Sparta. This is a map showing Ottoman Greece at the time when the Ottomans held sway over Greece. The yellow region, that is the region that was controlled by the Ottoman Turks, although in the 17th century, this region down here and some of these islands of Ionia were in the hands of the Venetians, and they went back and forth between the Ottoman Turks and the Venetians. But again, the Venetians controlled part of this region, part of Crete, which really by the 1600s was firmly under the control of the Turks called Hanya or Candia here. But this yellow region, Western Anatolia or Turkey, this region of Thrace and southern Bulgaria, firmly in the hands of the Ottoman Turks, off and on for 400 years. Now, I mentioned there were some regions that the Ottomans simply could not take control of, primarily that region in the southern central region of the Morea or the Peloponnese. This is the Mani region, and even today these are UNESCO World Heritage Sites which you can visit, these beautiful sort of hilltop villages, sort of reminiscent of villages of Tuscany, but in not good state of preservation. But these are the formidable strongholds of the Mani. And in Iperos, in northern Greece, in the Pindus Mountains, these regions the Ottoman Turks simply could not control. Now, the great city of Athens, too, for nearly 400 years was under the rule of the Ottomans. And many of you, of course, most of you, I think, have visited the city of Athens, and in and around the historic quarter of the Plaka near the Roman Agora, especially near the Library of Hadrian, you actually see vestiges of Ottoman buildings that date to the period of Ottoman rule, like this mosque in Monastiraki. There are Turkish baths or hammams, which still exist. But Athens fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1458 when the famous Florentine banking family of the Accioli, the last duke, had to surrender the city peacefully to the Ottomans. So this began the nearly 4 centuries of rule in the great city of Athens. But as I mentioned, the Venetians at times gained the upper hand, and for a very short period, Venice was occupied by the Venetians occupied Athens, but it was only for about 15 months But it was during this period that the Acropolis suffered some of its worst damage. In 1688, General Morosini, the famous Venetian general, later a Doge of Venice, ordered cannon fire on the Acropolis from Philippos Hill opposite the Acropolis. And some of the cannonballs hit the Parthenon. Unfortunately, the Ottoman Turks used the Parthenon as a storage for its armaments, for its explosives, and its gunpowder, I should say. And unfortunately, one of the Venetian cannonballs made a direct hit, and up went the Parthenon, and a monument which had been standing nearly intact for so many centuries, including its magnificent tiled ceiling, not of terracotta tiles, but Pentelic marble tiles, imploded. It collapsed. So this is perhaps one of the worst damages that the Acropolis suffered during, for nearly 11 centuries. Now, the Ottoman Turks redesigned the city of Athens, its Ottoman city. So the upper portion, the fortified Acropolis, was called the Castro. And this is where the governor's palace was located, where the Ottoman garrison was located. And at what time, right inside the Church of the Virgin Mary, right inside the Parthenon, I should say, during the Byzantine era, the Christians had constructed a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. So the Parthenon itself had been rededicated to the Virgin Mary. In the same way, Athena, to whom the Parthenon was dedicated, a virgin goddess, so too during the Christian era, the church was dedicated to Mary the Virgin. But once the Ottomans took control of Athens in 1458, they built a mosque literally inside the Parthenon. I'll show you a color engraving dating to 1715. And then the lower city was sort of the commercial quarter of Ottoman Athens. And this is where you would find the public markets. You had an upper and lower bazaar where commerce took place. And near the famous library of Hadrian, a monument which still exists today, that sprawling library constructed by the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the first quarter of the 2nd century, that area was converted to the famous Upper Bazaar, where fabulous, luxurious products from the Orient were sold to upper class Ottomans, or as well as to wealthy Athenians. Also, carpets, precious textiles, incense, exquisite, costly perfumes, etc. And here too, you would find the Turkish bathhouses, hammams, which are prominent edifices throughout the Ottoman Empire. And these were the public bathhouses constructed in the late 15th century, where both Ottoman men and women would go to clean and bathe themselves. And they were utilized at different times by Muslim men and women. There were also magnificent mansions built for the officials, for the beys, as well as wealthy members of Athens community who had affected alliances and enjoyed privilege and prestige under the Ottomans. Some of them, especially some family members, actually converted to Islam. We'll talk about the Devshirme system in a moment. But these costly, opulent mansions were modeled after Ottoman design, the so-called Katoy design system in which you had these beautiful open courtyards, long sweeping belvederes, arcaded upper floors. The lower floors had this so-called katoi, which was like an audience hall with side rooms for storing of goods. Many of these Athenians had made fortunes as bankers, as merchants, and they were at the forefront of a lot of the commerce during the Ottoman period and had made great fortunes, as did many Jewish Greeks during the period, during the long rule of the Ottomans. I'll show you some pictures now. So I mentioned that a mosque was constructed by the Ottoman Turks. This coloring painting dates to about 1715. So again, for nearly 380 years or so, a mosque was literally built and operating inside the Parthenon. So happily, the Ottoman Turks had not dismantled what was left of the famous Parthenon. This is that famous Venizelos Palaiologos mansion, now a museum, only opened a few years ago. It's the latest tourist attraction in the Plaka of Athens. Took a number of years to restore this heritage site, but again, it's this famous katoi system based upon Ottoman design. So you have two stories, this open air arcade where the private quarters of the Venizelos family would have been located. Here's a room from the south that you can see very much, it looks like a upper class Turkish house. If you go to Istanbul today, you can see some of these restored katoi mansions. And so we find them too in ancient Athens. These are the bathhouses, the hammams. This is what survives if you visit Athens today. Again, these are World Heritage Sites, and over the last decade, they have been lovingly restored. And one of the hammams has actually been altogether restored and converted, and today it's a very posh hammam that you can visit, and for a price enjoy, the luxurious rituals associated, the massages, the oil treatments, and plunging into the pools and enjoying a sauna at this hammam in the historic Roman agora quarter of the Plaka. Now, the Ottomans had a tremendous impact on Greek society, as you might expect. The 4 centuries rule of the Ottomans over the Greeks. And even though Greeks, even today, sort of resist, they hate the idea that the Turks influenced their society. Oh, they did in many, many ways. They affected their language. So many of the Greek specialties we enjoy today, like tzatziki, that wonderful yogurt, garlic, cucumber condiment that you can enjoy with a pita bread. Hey, that's actually Turkish word. This TZ, that's Turkish spelling, tzatziki. Some of the Greek surnames show the Ottoman influence. So the Michalis family became the Haji Michalis family. There's still a very prominent Greek family. Haji meaning members of their family had converted to Islam and had taken the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca. So this prefix in many Greek surnames, you find it, Haji. So meaning they had converted to Islam. So a lot of the garb of the Greeks was adapted from Turkish dress, like the fustanella, which is the famous nationalistic skirt that men wear. Here you can see it here. To show various Greek costume inspired by the Turks. Look at that fez hat, very much inspired by Turkish headwear. The salware, the loose-fitting silk trousers, all of these, and there were regional differences. Now, it is true that in the Balkan region, Slavic region, mountainous region, the Greeks had adapted these certain styles, but ultimately it was the Ottoman court that very much influenced the garb of, especially of upper class Greeks in the various regions that were controlled by the Ottomans. Also, food like souvlaki, kebabs, baklava, that wonderful Turkish Greek confection of phyllo dough and stuffed with honey and walnuts or pistachios. Well, again, as I mentioned, if you go to if you go to Greece and say, "Oh, wow, this is almost like a Turkish delicacy," they won't be very happy. But ultimately, that's the truth. And as I mentioned, many Greeks became fabulously wealthy. The Greeks were the great shipbuilders, the great ship owners, the great merchants, especially after the Battle of Lepanto. That's when the Greeks and the Spaniards and the Italians decisively defeated the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Corinth at the epic Battle of Lepanto or Naupactus in 1571. That prevented the naval fleet from further incursions into Europe and ultimately stopped the naval fleet from further advancement, one of the most famous battles in world history. So thereafter, the Greeks and the Venetians as well had control of much of the Western Mediterranean, and many Greek uh, merchants and shipbuilders became immensely wealthy and were the great maritime entrepreneurs and had a virtual monopoly over trade in this region. Now, the old Byzantine rulers, the old Greek elite, prior to the arrival of the Ottomans, kind of collapsed. A lot of them lost their holdings to the Ottoman overlords who seized their rich, fertile agricultural lands. And in turn, a new Greek elite emerged called the Prokritoi, or in Turkish, the Kajibashi. And here you see a Kajibashi. This is a famous 19th century painting of this sort of Greek overlord who looks for all the world like a Turkish official, but he's Greek, luxuriating on his sedan. But this became the new Greek elite, the Greek bureaucrats, the tax collectors that the average Greek despised because they were in the service of the Sublime Porte in Istanbul. They became immensely wealthy at the expense of the Greek peasant farmers and the average Greeks. They were very corrupt, and a lot of them were singled out for assassination, etc. So the Greeks, even though they were under the yoke and oppressed for centuries by their Ottoman overlords, nonetheless, there were Greeks who thrived and who flourished. And the most prosperous were those Greeks living in the capital of Constantinople, now Istanbul. These were the Phanariots, or the Phanoriotis Greeks, who lived in a distinctive quarter in historic Constantinople. And even today, there is but a small population of Phanariotis Greeks. This is where the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Greek equivalent of, let's say, the Pope in Rome. Now, Erdogan would very much like to finally close the Patriarchate. He has, of course, reconverted the great Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, which had been a museum begun by Ataturk in the 1920s, now sanctified once again as a mosque, but enormous pressure by the regime of Erdogan to end the Greek presence in the great city of Constantinople, of Istanbul. We'll see what happens over the next few years, but I'm not terribly optimistic. So that's the Ottoman influence, tremendous influence that the Ottoman Turks had on the Greeks during the nearly 4 centuries that the Turks ruled Greece. Now, one of the most famous institutions, if not infamous institutions, during the Ottoman rule of Greece was the so-called death Shirme system. Now, as we've mentioned in previous lectures, and even during our discussion of the Armenians when they were ruled off and on by the Ottomans, those under Ottoman sway had to pay a special poll tax. Oh, sorry about that. The X is gone here, but the poll tax called the jizya tax. So long as that was paid annually, you Greeks, you Jews, you Armenians could enjoy a certain amount of freedom, a certain amount of autonomy. You didn't have to convert to Islam. You could practice your own religion so long as you paid this tax. For the most part, non-Muslims were not were not conscripted into the army of the Sultan, but under the so-called tribute of children, the so-called death Shirme system, young boys, whether they were Greek or Slavic, were forcibly conscripted into the Ottoman military, especially into the elite corps called the Janissaries, the filled Janissary army of the Ottoman Empire, one of the most celebrated fighting armies in world history. And many Greek and Slavic youth became part of this elite army corps, so-called Def Shirme, with what the Greeks called Paidomazoma, or the child gathering, which what it was. So annually, Turkish officials would literally abduct unless the Greek families willingly surrendered one of their boys. So normally, one of five one of five of the boys, because Greek families at that time had many children, so one of the boys had to be raised a Muslim. So he had to convert from Greek Orthodoxy to Islam, and he then would become part of the Janissaries. If not a member of the Janissary army, he might become an important member of the state bureaucracy in Istanbul. It had this overarching, elaborate bureaucratic system, as you well know, in the great city of Istanbul. And there, many of these young Greek boys, having converted to Islam, as well as young boys from the Balkan region, were reared and raised as young members, as young Islamic boys, and they would advance many to very high offices, including that of Grand Vizier, the equivalent of the prime minister of the Ottoman Turkish state. Some of them became some of the greatest architects, like the architect Sinan, who during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century was responsible for some of the greatest mosques, some of the greatest Ottoman edifices ever that you see still dotting Istanbul. Some became famous naval commanders. So although this Def-Shermay system was foisted upon, forcibly placed upon the Greeks, for many Greek youths, it meant a better life. It meant advancement. Now, there are horrible, horrific stories of bloodshed, of the forcible capture of Greek youth, butchery, uh, during these so-called recruitments. And there were actual riots which took place, like the riot of 1705 in the great city of Salonika, in which the Greek population tried to resist the Def-Shermay system, but it was put down, and many of the flower of Greek society in Salonika were beheaded. So it was an interesting system, but a system that in many cases did offer a better life to many Greeks and Slavic youth. There was bribery, as you might expect. Many of the wealthier Greeks were in a position to bribe Ottoman officials, in return for which their children did not have to be sent off to Istanbul to become janissaries or members of the imperial court. This is a very famous painting showing young Greek boys at the court of the Sultan, at the Sublime Porte in Istanbul. They're in red. They wore this red costume. And this is a famous painting showing them showing obeisance, showing their loyalty before the sultans recruited into the janissaries. Greek historians have estimated that as many as 1 million Greeks over the course of nearly 4 centuries were conscripted into the elite corps of the janissaries. Oops, this is a mistake. This is from one of the earlier lectures. Forgot to remove that. Let's talk about the role of the Orthodox Church. Now, the Greek Orthodox Church remained the most powerful and influential institution during the 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. More than any other institution was the Greek Orthodox Church that would preserve the customs, the traditions of the Greeks, the Greek heritage, and maintain the legacy of Greek Orthodoxy. And during the Greek War of Independence, it was the Greek Orthodox Church that symbolized Greek nationality and identity. The Ottoman Turks safeguarded the Greek citizens from Islamic discrimination. And the Greek Orthodox Church, although it was persecuted during some periods, it actually flourished as a result of the largesse of the Ottoman court. So the Patriarch of Constantinople, who in many ways was like the Greek equivalent to the Roman Catholic Pope, was at once the spiritual head of the Greek community as well as the temporal authority, the ethnarch, the political leader of the Greek people. and he served at the pleasure of the sultan. So it was very necessary to play power politics for the Patriarch of Constantinople to earn the favor and protection of the Sultan. And there are many stories of certain patriarchs who are on very good terms with the Ottoman Sultan. Not only was the Patriarch of Constantinople the spiritual leader of the Greek Orthodox, but also the Latin speaking community. So there were Catholics also that lived in Greece during the reign of the Ottoman Turks, as did Slavs, as I mentioned. So the Patriarch was this spiritual leader as well as an ethnarch, the Greek word for leader of the nation. So the Patriarch was accountable to the Sultan, and it was up to the Patriarch to sort of maintain the peace among the population so they wouldn't rise up in revolt against the Sublime Porte of Istanbul. So wide latitude, wide autonomy for the most part. So here you see the Sultan Mehmet giving a special dispensation to the Patriarch of Constantinople, the famous Patriarch Gennadius, this sort of firman or a legal document according rights to the Patriarch and the Greek Orthodox Church. Now, the Orthodox priests worked alongside those Greek officials that the everyday Greek citizens hated, the Greek bureaucrats and the tax collectors that I mentioned earlier, the kajibashis, as they were called in Turkish, or the prokritoi. So they were essentially the officials and the rulers of the various Greek towns of the Morea and the rest of the Greek mainland. So the Orthodox Church was the church that preserved Greek identity, preserved the Orthodox Church, and would preserve the Greek language, as we'll discuss. Now, alongside the Greek Church, the Orthodox Church also established secret schools. Now, there are many modern day Greek historians who question the veracity of how extensive these so-called krifoskolio, or secret schools established by the Orthodox Church, were, how widespread. But a number of documents have come to light over the course of the last 10 years, especially from the archives and the libraries of Mount Athos and other church libraries, that do show that many famed monasteries throughout Greece maintained these secret schools unbeknownst to Turkish authorities, where the Greek language was kept alive, and the development of a new vernacular Greek language that would be created called Katharevousa, purified Greek. And here you see a Greek monk teaching young Greek boys and later Greek girls. And they also were very active. So the krifoskolio, and this word krifo is like the Greek word crypto, meaning secret or sub rosa or in the dark. This is just a variant, krifo, the secret schools, the skolio. And at these schools, illiterate guerrilla brigands known as klephts, K-L-E-P-H-T, and look at this Greek word, it's like the word klept or klepto. We're familiar with that word, kleptomania, a person who has an obsession to steal things. This again is a Greek variant of kleptos, cleft. The klephts were the famed Greek brigands or highwaymen We'll learn much more about them in a moment, but especially when we talk about the epic clefs during the Greek War of Independence, these colorful warrior chieftains and adventurers. They were taught the Greek language at the underground schools, the Scolio. And as you might expect, many were allowed to operate and kept open once the church officials or wealthy members of Greek society bribed Turkish officials. There is one terrible chapter in the history of these underground churches, the famed underground school at Smyrna, modern day Izmir, where there was a very sizable Greek population, many who suffered a massacre, persecuted like the Armenians after World War I, the horrific persecution and massacre of the Greeks of Smyrna. Well, their famous school was attacked because it was teaching mathematics and philosophy, and that was not looked upon favorably by the Turkish officials. So they persecuted the Greek priests who were operating the school. Eventually, it was closed down. Now, we do know there were attempts by Greek Orthodox clerics to obtain bequeaths and obtain the favor of the Russian church and the czars of Russia in order to help fund centers where the Greek language could be kept alive. And that, of course, was the primary reason for these secret schools. This is the major reason both the Greek Orthodox Church and these secret schools, this is why the Greek language was kept alive and would flourish. But we find the famous scholar and patriarch of the city of Alexandria in Egypt, Meletius Pigas, in the second half of the 16th century, so especially in the 1580s, he had made appeals to the czars of Russia in order to underwrite the study of Greek at these schools. Also, the famous metropolitan of Athens, Metaxas, who was a monk at the monastery of Pendeli, just outside of Athens, this beautiful monastery you can still visit today. Very pleasant visit to this tranquil monastery still operating. It was Metaxas who wrote in a letter that the Greek priests are responsible for the monasteries and parishes that must be maintained secretly in order to preserve our mother tongue, pure and immaculate. And that's why they created this purified language of Greek, a new Greek language called Katharevusa, not widely spoken, but was the language of the Greek priests and Greeks of an earlier generation, like my great-grandmother and grandmother spoke a very literate and purified, beautiful Greek called Katharevusa. This is what was developed during the 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. And as I mentioned, the famous clefs, these famous brigands. Here's a picture you see here to the left. Here you see a Greek cleft playing a Greek bouzouki. So when Constantinople fell, when Greece fell, when the last stronghold of Mistras fell, there were many Greeks, especially in the countryside, who resisted altogether the rule of their Islamic overlords and fled into the mountainside. And they're like Scottish Highlanders or Corsican brigands, became an armed guerrilla band of warriors who would often fight the Ottoman army and the Ottoman militia on the Greek mainland. And they didn't simply attack the Ottoman militia, but sometimes they would attack caravans of Greek merchants who had precious cargo. So they were brigands. They were kind of like Robin Hood's merry men, and they were often compared to Robin Hood and his merry men. And as you might expect, they were romanticized over the centuries. A lot of these very elaborate oral stories connected with the famous and colorful clefts, whom we'll discuss again. But a lot of them simply were escaping other vendettas. A lot of them did not want to pay the onerous taxes. Many of them were in debts and were being pursued by Turkish officials or the prokritoi, and were going to be thrown into prison. But we'll talk more about the famous clefts and some of the most illustrious during the Greek War of Independence. Many of them became very skilled musicians, and many of the Greek instruments, and again, some of them were very much inspired by Ottoman Turkish instruments, but the famous bouzouki, the famous Greek guitar, and certain other stringed instruments, these were taken up by the clefs, and they would sing songs, create poetry accompanied by music, telling stories of their exploits and later many of their great adventures and their exploits as warriors during the Greek War of Independence. Now, as you might expect, during the 400 years of Ottoman rule, there were a number of uprisings and revolts that were spurred on by feelings of patriotism and religious Greek Orthodox fervor. And a lot of them were encouraged by foreign powers, especially the Russians, who were Orthodox and brothers of the Greek Orthodox, and especially after the great defeat of the Greeks and the Spanish forces over the Ottoman navy at the famous Battle of Lepanto in 1571, there were uprisings against the Ottoman Turks in Epirus, which is the rugged mountain valley in northern Greece, already just a few years after Lepanto. One led by Athanasios of Ohrid, which is in Macedonia, in 1596, the famous Himara revolt in southern Albania, with the help of Spaniard money. And the Albanians was one of these revolts that enjoyed initial success, but eventually was crushed by the Ottoman army. Also revolts led by another illustrious Orthodox priest by the name of Dionysios Skilosophos. That's a very colorful epithet, meaning wily as a dog, clever as a dog. This famous bishop of Larissa in Thessaly led two revolts against the Ottoman overlords. Both of them were ultimately unsuccessful. The most famous, though, was led by the famous Russian Admiral Alexei Orlov, of the famous Orlov brothers. His famous brother Grigory was one of the many lovers of Catherine the Great of Russia. He led the famous Orlov Revolt of 1770, an attempt by the Russians to establish an independent Greek state with the backing of the czars of Russia. The Alexei Orlov had been in consultation for a few years with clefs or military leaders in the Mani region in the southern Peloponnese, and together they would lead a revolt against the Ottoman overlords. There were successes, but unfortunately the Maniotis did not have enough of the support of the Orlovs and Russian aristocrats as they had hoped, and eventually the lack of assistance on the part of the Russians to help the Greek guerrilla fighters, the Mani in the Peloponnese, would lead to the defeat in 1771 by the Ottomans. So 50 years later, the Greeks would have to wait in order to begin their great war of independence, their great war of liberation, the Greek War of Independence that would begin in 1821. So that is an overview of 400 years of Ottoman rule. Next week, I hope you do join me when we discuss how the Greek War of Independence really began with the wealthy Greeks of the diaspora, as well as great European intellectuals, lovers of Greece, Philhellenes, who would spawn the Greek war, were really the masterminds, the Greek intellectual movement that would lead to the Greek War of Independence, many of them students of the French Enlightenment, who would lead this first great war of independence against Ottoman rule, inspiring many other peoples under the yoke of Ottoman rule to launch wars of liberation. So we'll continue next week. Be safe and look forward to seeing you again next week.